Hello, welcome to Cultic Cube, your home for Magic the Gathering cube theory and resources. Today we're going to be doing a draft primer for the mono red deck, which is sometimes called the Fun Police. It's a much maligned deck and sometimes misunderstood deck. So by the end of the video today, we will have talked about why you might want to get into this deck. We'll talk about weaknesses of the deck. We'll look at an example deck. And we'll walk through a set of heuristics about that involve how to go about drafting this deck, a successful version of it. So for reference, we're going to be looking at my cube, which is called Aleasis. So it's an unpowered cube, no Moxen and the power 9 and so on. And let's just dive right in and start talking about this archetype. So the goal of Sly is to win the game quickly, often by turn 4 or 5. You want to be the beatdown. You want to keep your opponent on the back foot. Keep pressure on the opponent at all times. And you're hoping to tap out each turn. This definitely isn't a deck where you're holding up mana for counters and so on. You want to just keep laying down threats and trying to burn out your opponent. This deck I will refer to variously as Sly, Red Deck Wins, or Mono Red Aggro. These are terms that I'll be using rather interchangeably, although I recognize that there are some differences between these terms, but those differences aren't particularly important to us here. So what should the deck look like? You should have a very low curve. This is seminally important. So as you're well aware, the typical baseline for a draft deck or a limited deck in Magic is 23 spells to 17 lands. You can go up or down from there. This deck definitely wants to go up on the spell count and down on the land count. You should be running 24 and 16 or 25 and 15 even spells to lands if you can get your mana curve low enough. You can splash in so-called mono red, but you don't want to splash. You'd rather have as consistent a mana base as possible. If you are splashing, you'll generally splash black or white, and this is because your splash should be for really high quality removal rather than for creatures. You want to keep the number of color sources for your splash as low as possible. I'd say no more than 3. So if you're splashing white, you don't want to put more than 3 planes in the deck, because you badly need an untapped red source on turn 1 or your deck's just not going to function. You need to be applying pressure from the very first turn. So consequently, even high quality white aggro creatures shouldn't go in the deck because you want to construct a mana base that makes it unlikely that you'd have an untapped white source, for instance, on the first turn, or even on the first few turns. So let's look for reference now at a mono red draft deck. This is a 3/0 draft deck. This is not a perfect example of the genre, but it's a real example of the genre. This is a deck that I drafted and was successful with. So you'll notice I've got a lot of 1-drops. You badly want a density of 1-drop creatures. I've got, in fact, the best 1-drop red creature. Maybe the best 1-drop creature in Magic right here in the form of Goblin Guide, so that's a promising start. My curve is very low, as you see. My curve stops at 4. I've got 2 good aggressive 4 creatures here, and I've got a Chandra, Torch of Defiance, who's maybe a little iffy in the deck, but she rounds out the deck and she gives me a little more reach and some card selection. I've got lots of burn spells, as you'd well expect. Chain Lightning is the best burn spell I have here. I've got a number of Incinerate Lightning Strike effects here, doing 3 damage for 2 mana. Shrine of Burning Rage is key. This gives me a lot of reach. I don't have Sulfuric Vortex, which is still better than Shrine of Burning Rage, so that's too bad, but the deck functions without it. I have a couple of quality aggressive equipment. Umezawa's Jitta, which you probably know is um, a scary aggro equipment, and that has ruined many people's lives in limited formats over time. Grafted War Gear, another excellent aggressive equipment, arguably better than Umezawa's Jitta for our purposes here. They're both great though. So I've got a very low curve, stops at 4, so I can play a limited number of lands. You'll see I'm only running 15 lands. I'm running 14 mountains and then one a colorless mana source, which doesn't hurt the deck too much when there's just one of it, and it lets me take the opponent off problematic land. It's a strip mine effect. So to continue, weaknesses of this deck include expensive high toughness creatures like Wall of Omens. It's a 2 mana 0/4. That's very hard for my creatures to break through, as you will have seen. Most of them aren't doing 4 damage easily, and many of my burn spells are, of course, doing 3 damage, like Searing Spear and so on. So it's hard to get through a cheap wall with a big butt. Board wipes, of course, will ruin your day. Wrath of God effects. Remember, though, that you're trying to win by turn 4 or 5, which is to say you're trying to kill them ideally before the Wrath of God comes online. Or failing that, you want to have applied enough pressure that once you're wrathed, you can just throw a few lightning bolts towards their face and finish off the opponent. Pyroclasm effects are in some ways worse than wrath effects. These are sweeper effects that only do a limited amount of damage. But most of the creatures in the deck, as you may have seen, have 2 toughness or less. So this destroys most of the creatures in the deck. Finally, life gain effects. I've given as an example here Corsair of Kruphix because this kind of does it all. It's an inexpensive high toughness creature that also gains the opponent life. These are the cards you're afraid of, and if you're facing mono red, these are the kind of cards you want in your deck or that you want to sideboard into. Why draft this archetype? If you like red math, if you like math dealing with burn, which some people love, this is the deck to be in. If you want to play fast games, this is a deck to be in. Your games are going to resolve very quickly, either with a win, you hope, or you should realize pretty quickly at what point the opponent has turned the corner and stabilized such that it's going to be very difficult for you to win. And you can resign the game at a certain point. If it's impossible to win. This archetype also punishes metagames that have a lot of slow, dirtly decks, or punishes your friends who enjoy playing slow, dirtly decks. This is part of the classic rock, paper, scissors of Magic. If everybody's on these slow, controlling decks, then play the aggro deck. Go underneath them. Kill them fast before they have time to set up their big finish. So how do you get into this deck? Here are the first picks that are most exciting for Sly. The best by far is Goblin Guide. This guy is 10 years old now, but he is still probably the best one-drop creature in Magic. I mean, at least for this application. Best aggressive one-drop creature. He's got a downside, of course, but that's more or less irrelevant, you hope, because you're trying to kill them so fast that letting them draw a few extra lands isn't going to hurt that much. Next, we have Sulfuric Vortex. This gives you excellent reach, firstly, and secondly, it turns off life gain, which is quite important, because this is one of the ways that the opponent can get out of range of your deck. The Sly deck is tuned to deal 20 damage quickly. If your opponent can gain even a few life, that can help them stabilize potentially and put them out of range of your creatures and spells and so on. So Sulfuric Vortex turning off the life gain is a big deal. Sulfuric Vortex hurts you as well, but you, as the aggressive deck, typically don't care about your life total. If you are at a point where you do care about your life total, you've probably lost that game. Finally, Fiery Confluence. This is the newest of the spells here, and it is really a premium spell. This is a very high pick. I'd pick Fiery Confluence above even Lightning Bolt for this deck, which is saying quite a bit. This spell, just one card represents 6 damage to your opponent's face. That's huge. Lightning Bolt, excellent burn spell. But it's one card that represents 3 damage to the opponent's face or to any target. All right, so this is a pile of damage. Fiery Confluence gives you an awful lot of reach, and it does other things as well when necessary. So here I've developed a set of pick orders for the deck, and I know this looks like a big wall of text, but we'll go through these one by one. I'll just leave it up here for a moment so that you can pause here if you'd like. But let's go through the pick orders. So thing number 1 that you want, aggressive 1-drop creatures. I can't stress this enough. The deck doesn't function without 1-drops. You'll take as many as you can get, provided though that they're aggressive 1-drops. So you don't want things like Goblin Welders, for instance. So there are some that are going to be less desirable, but for the most part, you want all of them. So Goblin Welder is not going to do what you want it to do, for example, right? Grim Lavamancer, actually not amazing in the deck, although you'll probably take it, especially if you need playables. But all of these other guys who are like Jackal Pups or Savannah Lions are awesome. You want all these guys you can get. So I've highlighted Goblin Guide here because, as I said earlier, he's by far and away the best 1-drop that you have access to in most Legacy decks. Monastery Swift Spear is a distant second, in my opinion. Second best red 1-drop for the deck. I put Bomat Courier here not because it's the 3rd best 1-drop. It's certainly not. However, notice that it is not a red card, so I just want you to pay attention to cards that aren't strictly red that may be quite good for the deck. So Bomat Courier is still a fine 1-drop for the deck, and it can ideally refill your hand later in the game, give you a bunch more cards. This is effectively a red card, even though it's got the artifact border. The next thing you're looking for is cheap burn. Of course, Lightning Bolt is the best of these, even to this day. It was first printed in Alpha, it's the red part of the boon cycle. You still can't beat Lightning Bolt. 1 mana, deal 3 to anything. Chain Lightning is, arguably next best. It's a sorcery speed Lightning Bolt. You can basically ignore the flavor text on it with the pay double red to do something else. And then finally, many cubes, ours included, include many versions of Incinerate, which is to say many versions of the 2 mana deal 3 instant speed burn. And we can look at some of these in our cube. So if we go down the red section here, you'll see we've got Abrade, Incinerate, Lightning Strike. Magma Jet only deals 2, but it lets you scry 2, which is good. Searing Blaze can do 3. Searing Spear. So we've got a number of these 2 mana, deal 3s. Thirdly, you're looking for inevitability. Sulfuric Vortex, as I said earlier, is by far the best of these spells, but you've got other options. Shrine of Burning Rage is really quite good, too. Hazoret the Fervent is a little bit of a stretch. It does provide you reach when the game is stalled out. You can just start converting your draws into shocks. But this isn't, Hazoret the Fervent is a much lower pick than the other two. Ideally, I wouldn't really want to put Hazoret the Fervent in my slide deck, although I certainly do and have. Next, you're looking for inexpensive, efficient creatures. Here, I've given an example of the best 2-drop and best 3-drop aggressive red creatures. Karizev, this is maybe debatable, but she's an excellent 2-drop creature. You want absolutely as many 1-drops as you can get your hands on. 2-drops too, jam them in the deck. Goblin Rabblemaster, we have, this is a 3-drop creature. This is the best red 3. This is one of the best 3-drop creatures in any color, in my opinion. This guy does a lot. And Wizards has given us 4 versions of this gentleman now, of which we run 3 in our cube. And they are all excellent. We can look at some of these guys. So we have, there's Karizev, for instance. But here's Goblin Rabblemaster, the big daddy here, the first of this effect. Handweir Garrison, I would argue, is the second best after Rabblemaster. And then third best, I would argue, is the new Legion Warboss, who is a new version of this card. There's also Najeela, the Blade Blossom or something from, what, Battle Bond, possibly? We're not running her. I think she's the fourth best, personally. And I don't really want to run Infinite Rabble-Masters, but we are running 3 of them. Finally, I put Smuggler's Copter here, not because I think that this is the third best of these cards, but again, look for artifacts, look for good, aggressive vehicles, as in this case. And Smuggler's Copter is great in the deck. It loots for you, and it's an evasive 3/3 flying creature for 2. You have to be able to turn it on, so there are downsides, but very good in the deck. Fifth, you want to look for inexpensive aggressive equipment. This is key to getting your goblin guides and so on big enough to rumble, especially later in the game, and pile on some damage. So the best of these, I would say, is Grafted War Gear. 3 mana to play it, 0 to equip it, and it gives +3/+2. That's huge, of course. Grafted War Gear is something like a 3 mana, 3/2 with haste. That's a good card when you think of it that way. Of course, it's got some downside, but that's not going to be super relevant, usually. Umezawa's Jitta, excellent card. Card doesn't need much introduction. It does it all. It's very scary to see an aggressive opponent resolve an Umezawa's Jitta. Thirdly, Bone Splitter, not as good by far as these other 2, but still 1 to play, 1 to equip, gives +2/+0, that's great. Another to look out for is Heirloom Blade. We're not currently running it, but that's another fine aggressive equipment. Maybe goes after Bone Splitter in power level, but it's close. Next, you want to look for Burn that does more than your typical burn spell. So as we've already intimated, most burn in Magic is going to top out at doing 3 for 1 card, at least for a reasonable price. So you want to find cards that can cheaply do more than 3 damage. Those are very valuable cards. Char is a classic, 3 mana to deal 4. Again, your life total doesn't matter, so don't be afraid of taking 2. Next, Fire Blast. When it's 6 mana deal 4, that's not great, but it's fine if the game is stalled out and you have the mana. But you can cast the card for free. I mean, free in air quotes. You sack 2 mountains. And so you can deal 4 without paying any mana. That's a great way to finish a game. Finally, Fiery Confluence. I've already discussed this card and my love for it. It's an amazing card. Incredibly high pick for a Sly deck. Pick it up aggressively. In fact, any deck that's playing some measure of red, some reasonable measure of red, since this has 2 red pips in the casting cost, is going to want Fiery Confluence. So others will fight for it, which means you need to pick it all the more highly. 7, you want a few finishers. The 4 mana finishers are the ones you're looking for, and they need to have haste. So Hellrider is a classic these days. It converts all of your attackers into, attackers that have 1 more power effectively. Or maybe that's not quite right, but Hellrider piles on the damage, as I'm sure you well know. A newer one is Territorial Hellkite. It may look a little wonky, because I recognize that it only attacks every other turn, and you don't get to block with it on the off turns. But the card is excellent. It's like a 4 mana lava axe that you get to cast every other turn without paying mana except the first time, right? So that's a fine card. Finally, Fleet Wheel Cruiser. Again, look for good aggressive vehicles. This guy is great because he's got pseudo evasion in the sense that he's got trample. He's got haste, which we've said is key, and notice that when you play this card, he comes into play as an artifact creature. He sort of crews himself the first go round, and then only after that do you have to crew him, and the crew cost is quite reasonable at 2. That guy gets some damage through. You can put 5 mana finishers in the deck, but these are not desirable, and if possible, I would try hard to avoid putting 5 mana spells in the decks. So, as you will recall, in our example deck that we were looking at, I'm playing no 5 mana spells, period, right? Nothing costs more than 4. So I've got Hellrider and Territorial Hellkite here. Notice I've only got 12 creatures in this deck, and I would have liked to have had more creatures. But, the deck worked out fine. So if you are going to put 5 mana creatures in the deck, you again want to be looking at hasty ones. So Thundermaw Hellkite is great. He does 5 damage. He's more or less a lava axe. Hard to block, incredibly hard to block, especially the turn he comes down, because he's going to tap all their blockers and he's going to clear out all of those annoying lingering souls tokens that are trying to chump you and so on. Glorybringer, he's a flame tongue Kavu who flies. He's very good. Zealous Conscripts is a card that I think we often associate with Kiki Twin combo, Kiki Jiki the Mirror Breaker, and Splinter Twin, because you can go infinite with one of those and Zealous Conscripts. But this is still a fine finisher, right? Especially once the opponent has tried to stabilize. They put some big blocker down. You play Zealous Conscripts on turn 5, you steal their big blocker, and you kill them with it, right? You're suddenly hitting them for 3 plus whatever that big blocker is doing. So that's a fine card for the deck, even if it looks a little less impressive than Thundermaw and so on. It can be better than the dragons. Finally, I look for a few card advantage or card selection tools. You don't want many of these in the deck. You want maybe one of these in the deck, and these are kind of an insurance policy. If you can't kill them with the hand that you're dealt and the few cards that you draw a few more cards, or you look at a few more cards. 2 of the best new tools for Sly come from the latest set. So, our Ravnica 3. So Light Up the Stage is brand new from RNA, and Experimental Frenzy is from GRN, Guilds of Ravnica. Light Up the Stage is probably the best card advantage spell for red. It's a red divination that's even cheaper. I mean, that's not exactly right, but it's pretty close. It's very good. Experimental Frenzy is kind of a slower card than you badly want to put in the deck, but it does an awful lot. This is a red Future Sight, effectively, that you can actually cast. Future Sight has 3 blue pips in the casting cost. It's kind of crazy. But Experimental Frenzy lets you play off the top of the deck. You should be able to play lots of cards off the top of your deck because you've got cheap cards in your deck, right? Also, and this is key, you can turn off Experimental Frenzy and then play your hand again. That's really good that you can blow up your own enchantment. Finally, Faithless Looting is a classic, and it's still very good. It's always, I mean, it's for a very long time been some of my air quotes secret tech for my slide decks that I throw into Faithless Looting. Because Faithless Looting, I think we often associate with Reanimator strategies, things that care about the graveyard, and Faithless Looting is great there with your Goblin Welders or your Reanimators or whatever reanimates. But it's good in Sly too. It lets you pitch excess lands, is the main thing, right? And then you get to do it again. That's sort of amazing. So I'll go back here for a moment to our pick order list. But anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this video and feel that you have a better sense of how best to go about drafting Sly. It's a fun archetype, and it's one worth trying. You can really get people with it. So thank you very much. Please feel free to leave comments, and I'll put a link to my cube in the description. Thanks for watching.